December in the Ardennes forest arrived with the kind of cold that turned bone marrow to ice and made breathing feel like swallowing shards of glass. The pine trees stood like dark sentinels against a gray sky that promised more snow, always more snow, and the ground was frozen so hard that digging foxholes required pickaxes and desperation. In the small Belgian town of Bastogne, where cobblestone streets wound between medieval buildings that had survived centuries of European warfare, 26-year-old Ruth Kowalski, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was about to face a defining moment of a war that had already taken everything she loved. She had arrived in Belgium 3 months earlier as part of a medical unit attached to the 101st Airborne Division, a nurse trained to save lives in conditions where death was a default outcome. But the woman who stood in the freezing December dawn of 1944, checking and rechecking a Browning .30 caliber machine gun with movements that seemed almost ritualistic, was no longer just a nurse. She had become something else entirely. Something forged in the brutal kiln of total war, and what she was about to do would be remembered by the survivors of Bastogne as either the bravest or the most insane act they had ever witnessed. Ruth had grown up in the steel mills district of Pittsburgh, where her father worked the blast furnaces at Jones and Laughlin, where the sky was perpetually orange in the foundries and the air tasted of iron and coal smoke. The Kowalski family lived in a narrow row house on the south side, where Polish was spoken as often as English and where everyone knew everyone else's business, for better or worse. Her father had come from Krakow before the First World War, bringing with him old country traditions and a work ethic that bordered on obsessive. Her mother had died giving birth to Ruthen's younger brother in 1932, during the worst years of the Depression, when hospitals were luxuries and home births too often ended in tragedy. That loss had shaped Ruthen in ways she didn't fully understand until much later, had planted in her a determination to master the skills that might have saved her mother, to never again feel the helplessness of watching someone die because knowledge or resources weren't available. She had attended nursing school at Mercy Hospital, working night shifts as an orderly to pay her tuition, studying by candlelight when the electricity was shut off because her father's wages couldn't cover everything. She had graduated in 1940, one of 3 women in her class who weren't from wealthy families, one of few who had seen death up close before ever setting foot in a hospital ward. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Ruth was working at Mercy Hospital in the emergency ward, treating industrial accidents and street violence and all the mundane tragedies of urban life. She heard the news on the radio during her lunch break, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of watery coffee and a sandwich she hadn't had time to eat. Around her, the normal hospital sounds, patients moaning, doctors being paged, the endless mechanical breathing of the building itself, all seemed to pause as everyone absorbed what had just happened. America was at war, attacked on its own soil, and nothing would ever be the same. Ruthen's first thought was of her younger brother Tommy, who was 19 and working at the mill alongside their father. Tommy would enlist. She knew this with absolute certainty, because Tommy had always been the brave one, the one who ran toward trouble instead of away from it. She was right about that. He enlisted 3 days later, lying about a heart murmur that should have disqualified him, joining the Marines because he said they were the first to fight, and he wanted to be where the action was. By February 1942, he was at boot camp in Paris Island. By August, he was dead on Guadalcanal, killed by a Japanese sniper while trying to rescue a wounded corpsman. His body left in the jungle for 3 days before it could be recovered. Ruthen received a telegram at the hospital, delivered by a Western Union boy who couldn't have been more than 16, who looked at her with eyes that said he understood this was the worst moment of her life. She read it once, folded it carefully, put it in her pocket, and finished her shift. She didn't cry until 3 days later, when she was alone in her room and the reality finally broke through the shock. Then she cried for hours, great racking sobs that felt like they might tear her apart. And when she was finished crying, she made a decision. She would join the Army Nurse Corps and go overseas. If Tommy could die for his country, she could at least try to save the men who were dying alongside him. I know our audience is made up of intelligent and perceptive people like you. Those who understand that the most powerful stories are often the ones history tried to forget. If you value content that brings these hidden moments into the light, that honors the courage of those who serve in ways we never learn about in school, consider subscribing. Your support helps us keep telling these stories that desperately need to be told. The Army Nurse Corps accepted her application in November 1942, and by January 1943, she was at Fort Meade in Maryland, learning military medicine in conditions designed to simulate combat. They taught her to perform surgery in tents, to treat sucking chest wounds and arterial bleeding and traumatic amputations, to make triage decisions that meant choosing who would live and who would die. They taught her to work under bombardment, to ignore explosions and gunfire while focusing on the patient in front of her, to function on no sleep and little food while maintaining the clarity of judgment that meant the difference between saving a life and losing one. It was brutal training, deliberately so, because the Army had learned in North Africa and Sicily that nurses who couldn't handle combat conditions broke down in ways that endangered both themselves and their patients. Ruth excelled at the training, not because she was naturally gifted, but because she was willing to work harder than anyone else, to study longer, to practice procedures until they became instinctive. She graduated in April 1943 and shipped out to England in May, assigned to a field hospital that would support the invasion of Europe whenever it finally came. She spent a year in England, treating bomber crews and training casualties, watching the buildup of men and material that everyone knew would eventually be unleashed across the Channel. She was there on D-Day, June 6, 1944, when the invasion finally came, when the hospital filled with casualties faster than they could process them, when she worked for 36 hours straight without sleeping, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she cleaned wounds and administered morphine and held the hands of young men who were dying far from home. By September 1944, the Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France, liberating towns that had been occupied for 4 years, pushing toward the German border with momentum that made victory seem inevitable. Ruthen's unit moved with the advance, setting up field hospitals in liberated towns, treating casualties from increasingly desperate German resistance. She had seen things by then that would haunt her for the rest of her life, had watched men die from wounds that should have been survivable, had held soldiers as they called for mothers who would never see them again, had learned that war was nothing like the newsreels or the patriotic speeches, that it was instead a grinding machinery that consumed young lives with industrial efficiency. By December, her unit was attached to the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, who were recuperating near Reims after brutal fighting in Holland. The 101st were paratroopers, elite troops who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and who had a reputation for ferocity in combat and indiscipline out of it. Ruthen found them arrogant and difficult, but she also found them fascinating. These young men who had chosen to jump out of perfectly good airplanes into enemy fire, who seemed to court death with recklessness that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. She had just started to feel comfortable with the unit, to learn their rhythms and personalities, when everything changed in the space of a single morning. December 16th, 1944 began with fog so thick that visibility was measured in feet rather than miles. The Ardennes forest was quiet, an area of the front considered so inactive that it was used as a rest sector for tired divisions and a training ground for new units. Ruthen was at an aid station in a small village east of Bastogne, drinking ersatz coffee and reading a letter from her father that had taken 3 weeks to arrive. The letter talked about the mills running at full capacity, about neighborhood boys who had enlisted, about how much he missed her and Tommy and wished the war would end so life could return to normal. She was halfway through reading it for the second time when the first shells started falling. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge began with an artillery barrage that was unlike anything the Americans in the Ardennes had experienced. Thousands of guns opened up simultaneously, turning the morning fog into a hellscape of fire and shrapnel and screaming steel. The aid station took a direct hit within the first 10 minutes, the building collapsing in a cloud of dust and smoke and splintered wood. Ruthen survived because she had been standing near a reinforced wall, but 3 other nurses and 2 doctors didn't. She pulled herself from the rubble with a dislocated shoulder and blood running down her face from a scalp wound, and for a moment, she stood in the ruins trying to process what had just happened. Then training took over. She began pulling survivors from the wreckage, organizing evacuation, preparing to treat casualties that she knew would soon overwhelm them. The German attack was massive, Three armies totaling more than 200,000 men smashing into the lightly defended American lines with the objective of driving through to Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies in half. It was Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to change the course of a war that Germany was clearly losing, and initially, it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. American units were overrun, surrounded, forced to retreat in chaos through the fog and snow. Bastogne, a small market town at a critical road junction, suddenly became the most important position in the entire sector. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the road network that German armor needed to maintain their advance. The 101st Airborne received orders to move to Bastogne immediately, to hold the town at all costs, and Ruthen's medical unit moved with them. They reached Bastogne on December 19th, driving through snow and German infiltrators, arriving just hours before German forces surrounded the town. By December 20th, Bastogne was cut off, encircled by German troops who had orders to take the town quickly or bypass it if resistance was too strong. The Americans in Bastogne, about 18,000 men, including the 101st Airborne, elements of several armored divisions, and various support units, prepared for a siege with the certain knowledge that help wouldn't arrive for days or possibly weeks. They had limited ammunition, little food, no winter gear because the offensive had caught them by surprise, and they were facing German forces that outnumbered them by at least 4-1. Ruthen set up her aid station in the basement of a half-destroyed hospital on the edge of town, a stone building that had been hit by artillery, but whose basement was still mostly intact. The conditions were medieval: no running water, intermittent electricity from a generator that ran on fuel they couldn't spare, and cold so intense that plasma froze in its bottles and had to be thawed before it could be administered. Within 24 hours, the aid station was overwhelmed with casualties. Men came in with frostbite, so severe their fingers snapped off like icicles, with wounds from shrapnel and bullets, and the new German Panzerfaust rockets that burned white-hot. She worked around the clock, sleeping in 20-minute intervals when exhaustion forced her to stop, eating cold rations that tasted like cardboard and grease. The situation in Bastogne deteriorated rapidly. German artillery pounded the town constantly, and German infantry probed the defenses from every direction, looking for weak points. On December 22nd, German officers approached under a white flag to demand surrender. The American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, responded with a single word that would become famous: nuts. The Germans didn't understand the idiom and had to have it explained that it meant no. Under no circumstances would Bastogne surrender. The siege continued, growing more desperate with each passing day. Ammunition ran so low that soldiers were ordered to fire only when they could see targets. Food was rationed to 1 meal per day, and that meal was usually just crackers and whatever could be scrounged from abandoned houses. Medical supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Ruthen performed surgeries without anesthesia because the morphine had run out, holding down screaming soldiers while she removed shrapnel or amputated limbs that had gone gangrenous. It was on December 24th, Christmas Eve, that Ruthen's life intersected with the Browning .30 caliber machine gun that would define her legacy. One of the aid station's few security detachments, a squad of paratroopers who had been assigned to protect the medical staff, took casualties during a German attack that penetrated to within 2 blocks of the hospital. The squad leader, a sergeant from Kentucky named James Doherty, was brought in with his legs shredded by shell fragments. He died while Ruthen was trying to stop the bleeding, his last words a mumbled apology for not keeping his men safe. His death left the aid station with only 3 soldiers for security, 3 exhausted men who had been fighting continuously for 8 days and who couldn't possibly defend the position if the Germans made a serious push. The situation terrified the other nurses, most of whom had never been this close to direct combat, who had assumed that medical facilities would be respected even in the chaos of battle. Ruthen knew better. She had seen what happened when German troops overran aid stations, had heard stories from other nurses about rapes and executions, and wounded men being shot in their beds. She made a decision that seemed insane to everyone else but made perfect sense to her. She would learn to use the Browning .30 caliber machine gun that the security detachment had positioned in a sandbag emplacement outside the aid station's entrance. If the Germans came, she would fight them, Not because she had any illusions about military glory, but because the alternative, waiting helplessly to be overrun, was unacceptable. The Browning .30 caliber was an intimidating weapon, a water-cooled machine gun that weighed over 40 pounds with its tripod, that fired at a rate of 500 rounds per minute, that required careful handling and constant maintenance to avoid jamming. Sergeant Doherty had shown it to her once, explaining the basics with the patient tone of someone who didn't expect her to remember anything but wanted to be polite. She had paid attention then, filing away information she thought she might never use, and now she was grateful for his brief lesson. She spent what was left of Christmas Eve familiarizing herself with the weapon, stripping it down and reassembling it, learning the weight and balance, understanding how the belt-fed ammunition worked, and how to clear the jams that were inevitable with machine guns in freezing conditions. One of the remaining security soldiers, a private from Texas named Martinez, watched her work with undisguised skepticism. He told her bluntly that she was wasting her time, that operating a machine gun in combat required strength and experience she didn't have, that she would get herself killed if she actually tried to use it. Ruthin listened politely, thanked him for his concern, and continued working. She had learned long ago that men often underestimated women, especially in military contexts, and that arguing was pointless. The only response that mattered was performance. She needed to prove not that she could use a weapon in some theoretical sense, but that she could use it effectively under the conditions that actually existed, in sub-zero temperatures with frozen fingers and German troops trying to kill her. The technique she developed came from necessity and observation, from watching how the male soldiers struggle with the weapon in extreme cold. The standard military procedure for loading and firing the Browning involved movements that required significant upper body strength and manual dexterity, both of which were compromised by cold and fatigue. Ruthin realized that she needed to adapt the technique to her own physical capabilities, which meant finding ways to use leverage and positioning rather than raw strength. She experimented for hours, trying different approaches, discovering that if she positioned herself at a specific angle and used her body weight in particular ways, she could operate the weapon almost as efficiently as a male soldier twice her size. The key was in how she loaded the ammunition belts, using a modified technique that looked awkward but allowed her to feed rounds smoothly even when her hands were numb with cold. When Martinez saw her technique, he laughed outright, calling it ridiculous, saying no real soldier would ever use such an awkward method. The other remaining soldiers agreed, making jokes about nurses playing soldier, about how she would drop the whole thing the first time she tried to fire it under pressure. Ruth didn't argue with them. She simply continued practicing, repeating the movements until they became automatic, until she could load and reload with her eyes closed, until the weight and rhythm of the weapon became as familiar as her own heartbeat. Christmas Day 1944 in Bastogne was a mockery of peace on Earth. The weather cleared briefly, allowing American transport planes to drop desperately needed supplies by parachute, but also allowed German artillery observers to call a more accurate fire. The aid station took several near misses, shells that exploded close enough to shower the building with debris and make the walls shake like they were about to collapse. Ruthin treated casualties all day, taking only brief breaks to check on the machine gun position and make sure the ammunition belts hadn't frozen solid. By evening, the situation had deteriorated to the point where everyone knew an attack was coming. German forces had been repositioning all day, moving units into assault positions, bringing up armor and artillery for what would clearly be a major push to take Bastogne before American reinforcements could arrive. Radio intercepts and reports from forward observers all pointed to the same conclusion. Tonight or tomorrow morning, the Germans would try to break through the American lines, and if they succeeded, Bastogne would fall and everyone inside the perimeter would be killed or captured. Ruthin spent that evening writing letters she hoped would be mailed if she didn't survive, letters to her father explaining that she had died doing something worthwhile, that he shouldn't grieve too much because she had made her own choices and lived according to her own principles. She wrote these letters in the aid station basement surrounded by wounded men who were also writing final letters, who also knew that death might be hours away. There was a strange intimacy in that moment, a shared understanding that transcended rank and gender and all the usual divisions, a recognition that they were all simply humans facing the possibility of extinction and trying to make peace with it in whatever way they could. The German attack began at 4:30 in the morning on December 26th, emerging from the pre-dawn darkness with a fury that seemed supernatural. Artillery fire walked across the town, systematically destroying buildings and cratering streets, driving the American defenders into their holes and bunkers. Behind the artillery came German infantry, hundreds of them, moving in coordinated waves supported by armor by the massive Tiger and Panther tanks that were nearly impervious to American weapons. The attack was aimed at multiple points on the perimeter, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. One of those attack points was the sector where Ruthen's aid station was located, a sector defended by perhaps 30 American soldiers who were exhausted and low on ammunition, and who knew they couldn't possibly hold against a force that was bearing down on them. The first wave of German infantry hit at dawn, materializing out of the smoke and darkness like ghosts in their white winter camouflage. They came fast, using fire and movement tactics that had been perfected through years of warfare, laying down suppressing fire while other soldiers advanced, then reversing roles, pushing forward relentlessly. The American defenders fought back with everything they had, rifles and machine guns and occasional bazooka shot at German armor, but they were being pushed back, their lines contracting under pressure that couldn't be sustained. Within 30 minutes, German troops had advanced to within 100 yards of the aid station. Within an hour, they were within 50 yards, close enough that Ruthen could hear them shouting to each other in German, could hear the distinctive sound of their MG-42 machine guns, the weapons that fired so fast they sounded like ripping fabric. The 3 soldiers assigned to defend the aid station were already engaged, firing from windows and doorways, trying to slow the German advance. But 3 men couldn't cover all approaches, couldn't be everywhere at once, and it was becoming obvious that the position would be overrun within minutes unless something changed dramatically. Ruthen made her decision with a clarity that surprised her. She told the other nurses to move the wounded to the deepest part of the basement, to prepare for capture or worse, to destroy any medical supplies that the Germans might use. Then she went to the machine gun position, that sandbag emplacement near the main entrance, and took up a position behind the Browning. Her hands were shaking, not from fear but from cold and adrenaline, and for a moment she wondered if she could actually do this, if all her practice would matter when real bullets were coming her way. Then she saw the first German soldiers rounding the corner of a destroyed building across the street, saw them moving with the confidence of men who believed they had already won, and something inside her crystallized into absolute focus. She applied her ridiculous loading technique, the one Martinez had laughed at, feeding the ammunition belt with movements that utilized leverage and body position rather than pure strength. The belt loaded smoothly, perfectly, and the Browning was ready to fire. The German soldiers were perhaps 40 yards away when Ruthen opened fire. The Browning roared to life with a sound that was physically overwhelming, a rapid hammering that shook her entire body and filled the world with noise and fury. The weapon was designed to kill efficiently, and it did exactly that, sending a stream of .30 caliber rounds downrange at 500 per minute, rounds that found targets with devastating effect. The first burst caught 3 German soldiers in the open, cutting them down before they could react, their bodies jerking as bullets impacted flesh and bone. The survivors went aground immediately, taking cover behind rubble and in shell craters, returning fire toward the aid station, but now pinned down by the machine gun. Ruthen adjusted her fire, short controlled bursts rather than continuous shooting, conserving ammunition and avoiding overheating the barrel. She was operating on pure instinct now, muscle memory from her hours of practice taking over, while her conscious mind retreated to someplace quiet and distant. She saw targets and engaged them, saw movement and suppressed it, performing with mechanical efficiency, while part of her watched from afar and marveled that this was actually happening, that she was actually doing this. The Germans tried to flank her position, sending soldiers through adjacent buildings, but the angles of fire she had prepared during her practice sessions covered those approaches. She caught one group emerging from a doorway 30 yards away, cutting them down before they could disperse. She caught another group trying to rush across the street, forcing them back with fire that chipped stone and ricocheted off frozen ground. For 20 minutes, Ruthen held that position alone, keeping perhaps 50 German soldiers pinned down and unable to advance. The machine gun was her entire universe. The weight of it, the sound, the smell of burning oil and propellant, the vibration that traveled through her arms and into her chest. Her hands moved automatically, reloading when ammunition ran low, using that awkward technique that somehow worked perfectly, that kept the gun fed and firing even as her fingers went numb and her shoulders ached from managing the recoil. She was dimly aware of American soldiers rallying behind her, using the suppressing fire she provided to regroup and establish better defensive positions. She was aware of German fire coming back at her, bullets hitting the sandbags and zipping past her head close enough to feel the air displacement, but none of that seemed real or important. What was real was a gun, keeping it fed and firing, keeping those German soldiers pinned and unable to advance. Then the ammunition belt ran dry, and she reached for another belt and found nothing. She had fired through all 4 belts they had stored at the position, more than 800 rounds, and there was no more immediately available. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. The gun was useless without ammunition, and German soldiers were already moving forward, taking advantage of the sudden silence. But then Martinez appeared at her side, dragging a wooden crate that held 6 more ammunition belts that should have been stored elsewhere, but that he had risked his life to retrieve. He said nothing, just loaded a fresh belt with shaking hands, while Ruth adjusted her position and prepared to fire again. The battle continued for another hour, a grinding, exhausting fight, where time became meaningless, and the only thing that mattered was keeping the gun operational and firing. Ruth went through 3 more ammunition belts with Martinez, feeding her and clearing jams when the cold caused the mechanism to stick. Other American soldiers, seeing what was happening, rallied to the aid station's position, turning it from a vulnerable medical facility into a strong point that the Germans couldn't bypass or ignore. They brought more ammunition, more defenders, transforming the defense in ways that might have seemed miraculous if anyone had had time to think about it. But no one was thinking. They were simply fighting, simply trying to survive one more minute and then another. German casualties mounted as they threw more men at the position, trying to break through by sheer weight of numbers. Bodies accumulated in the street, in doorways, behind rubble where wounded Germans cried for medics who couldn't reach them. It was slaughter, brutal and impersonal, the kind of killing that happened when modern weapons met human flesh. And Ruth was at the center of it, methodically working the Browning, engaging targets with the same focused precision she had once used to start IVs or suture wounds. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she recognized the horrifying irony that she had spent years learning to save lives and was now taking them with industrial efficiency, but that recognition was distant and abstract, something to grapple with later if there was a later. By mid-morning, the German attack on this sector had stalled completely. They had taken too many casualties, lost too many men to that devastating machine gun fire from the aid station, and their commanders made the decision to redirect their assault toward less well-defended positions. The firing tapered off, then stopped, and suddenly there was silence broken only by the moans of wounded men and the crackle of burning buildings. Ruth remained at the machine gun for another 30 minutes, watching for any renewed attack, unable to quite believe that it was over. Her hands were frozen into claws from gripping the gun. Her shoulders screamed with pain. Her ears rang from the sustained noise, and she was shaking uncontrollably from exhaustion and reaction. Martinez finally touched her shoulder gently, telling her it was okay, that she could let go now, that they would take over the watch. She released the gun and tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. She sat down heavily in the snow, still shaking, and Martinez wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and handed her a canteen of water that she couldn't drink because her hands were shaking too badly. After a while, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, she managed to walk back into the aid station where the other nurses were staring at her, like she was a stranger, like they couldn't reconcile the woman who had just held off a German assault with a nurse they had worked alongside for months. Ruth understood their confusion because she was experiencing herself. She didn't feel heroic or brave. She felt exhausted and nauseated and deeply troubled by what she had just done. The aftermath of the battle brought a flood of casualties, both American and German. The German wounded were brought to the aid station alongside American casualties, because Ruth refused to let any wounded man be turned away regardless of what uniform he wore. She treated them all with the same care and professionalism, working on German soldiers who hours earlier had been trying to kill her, holding their hands when they died far from home in a country that wasn't theirs, fighting for causes they might not have believed in. Some people thought this was wrong, that she should let the enemy die and save her limited supplies for Americans. Ruth disagreed in the strongest possible terms. She was a nurse before she was a soldier, and nurses didn't make distinctions based on nationality. The wounded were the wounded, and they all deserved whatever mercy medicine could provide. Over the next few days, as American forces finally broke through the German encirclement and relieved Bastogne, stories began to circulate about the nurse who had held off a German assault with a machine gun. The stories grew in the telling, as war stories always do, exaggerating numbers and circumstances, until Ruth became a figure of legend, the woman who had single-handedly stopped 200 Germans, who had fired 1,000 rounds without missing, who had stood her ground when trained soldiers fled. The reality was more complex and less dramatic, but the myth was what people needed to believe, and Ruth found herself thrust into a role she neither sought nor wanted. Military investigators came to interview her, trying to document exactly what had happened for official reports and possible medals. Ruth cooperated reluctantly, downplaying her role, emphasizing that Martinez and the other soldiers had been crucial to the defense, that she had simply done what circumstances required. The investigators were clearly disappointed. Having hoped for a narrative of individual heroism that could be used for propaganda purposes, they got instead a story about improvisation and necessity, about a woman who had adapted military procedures to her own capabilities not out of rebellion, but out of pragmatism. The loading technique she had developed, the one that had been mocked as ridiculous, was now being studied by weapons instructors who recognized its utility for smaller soldiers or for circumstances where standard techniques weren't practical. What had been dismissed as a woman's weakness was now being reconsidered as innovative problem-solving. The irony wasn't lost on Ruth, and, though she took no satisfaction from it, she hadn't developed her technique to prove anyone wrong or demonstrate that women could fight. She had done it to survive and to protect the wounded men in her care. Everything else was noise, the interpretations and meanings that other people impose on her actions. By mid-January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge ground towards conclusion and the German offensive collapsed in failure, Ruth was evacuated from Bastogne. She was suffering from frostbite in both hands, had lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose, and was exhibiting symptoms that would later be recognized as combat trauma, though in 1945 they just called it battle fatigue and expected people to get over it. She was sent to a rear area hospital in Paris to recover, supposedly for 2 weeks, but actually for almost 2 months. During that time, she learned that she had been recommended for a Bronze Star for Valor, an unusual recognition for a nurse, and one that generated controversy in some quarters. There were officers who thought combat decorations should be reserved for combat soldiers, who believed that recognizing nurses for fighting minimized the distinctions between combat roles and support roles. These objections were eventually overruled, and Ruth received her Bronze Star in a ceremony she didn't attend, being still hospitalized when it was awarded. She returned to duty in March 1945, assigned to a hospital in newly liberated Germany where casualties from the final push into the Reich were overwhelming the medical system. She worked there through the end of the war in May, treating German civilians alongside Allied soldiers, working in conditions that were somehow both better and worse than Bastogne. Better because there was adequate shelter and supplies, worse because the human devastation was so complete, the cities destroyed, the population traumatized, the realization of what the Nazi regime had done becoming impossible to ignore. Ruth witnessed the liberation of several concentration camps, saw horrors that made combat seem clean by comparison, and understood for the first time the full moral weight of the war she had been fighting. After Germany surrendered, she volunteered to remain in Europe rather than return to the States, working with displaced persons camps where millions of refugees struggled to survive in the ruins of their shattered continent. She stayed for 2 years until 1947, working in conditions that would have broken most people, but that Ruth found somehow necessary, as if she needed to atone for the killing she had done at Bastogne by saving as many lives as possible afterward. It was exhausting work, emotionally draining in ways that combat never was. But it also gave her purpose and prevented her from having to immediately confront what had happened to her during the war. When she finally returned to Pittsburgh in autumn 1947, the city felt foreign to her, as if she had been gone for decades rather than years. Her father had aged dramatically, his hair gone completely white, his hands trembling with palsy from too many years working the blast furnaces. He cried when he saw her, the first time she had ever seen him cry, holding her with a desperation that spoke to how much he had feared losing her like he had lost Tommy. They talked for hours that first night, Ruth and trying to explain what she had experienced and failing, her father trying to understand and failing, both of them eventually accepting that some things couldn't be communicated across the gap between those who had been there and those who hadn't. She tried to return to nursing at Mercy Hospital, but found that working in a civilian emergency room felt trivial after what she had experienced. The injuries were real and the patients deserved care, but it lacked the urgency and intensity of combat medicine. She lasted 6 months before resigning, unsure what she wanted to do or who she wanted to be now that the war that had defined her was over. She drifted for a while, working odd jobs, trying different things, never quite finding anything that felt meaningful. Then in 1949, she saw a notice in the newspaper about the Veterans Administration opening new hospitals to treat the flood of returning servicemen who needed long-term care. The VA was actively recruiting nurses, especially those with combat experience, offering good pay and the chance to serve the men who had served their country. Ruth applied and was hired immediately, assigned to a VA hospital in Maryland that specialized in treating combat trauma and psychological injuries. She worked at the VA for the next 35 years, until her retirement in 1984. It was where she found her calling, working with veterans who carried invisible wounds, who woke screaming from nightmares, who couldn't adjust to civilian life after years of war. Ruth understood these men in ways that other nurses couldn't, because she carried her own invisible wounds, her own nightmares about that morning at Bastogne, when she had killed until killing became mechanical. She never talked about her wartime experiences to her patients, never used her own history as a way of establishing credibility. But somehow the veterans knew. They recognized something in her, some quality of understanding that came from shared experience, and they trusted her in ways they couldn't trust others. She helped thousands of men over those decades, sitting with them through nightmares, listening to confessions that they couldn't share with anyone else, providing the kind of care that went far beyond medical treatment. She married briefly in the late 1950s, a veteran she met at the hospital who seemed to understand her in ways civilian men didn't. The marriage lasted 3 years before ending in quiet divorce, both of them recognizing that they had come together out of shared trauma rather than genuine compatibility. There were no children, no family except her aging father who died in 1968, and Ruth had made peace with that, understanding that some people were meant for solitary paths. Her life was her work, and her work was meaningful in ways that transcended conventional definitions of success or happiness. The machine gun technique she had developed at Bastogne, the ridiculous loading method that had been mocked and then vindicated, eventually made its way into training manuals as an alternative procedure for soldiers of smaller stature or for circumstances where standard techniques weren't practical. It was never officially attributed to her, never called the Kowalski method or given any recognition, just absorbed into the broader body of military knowledge, as these things always are. Ruth didn't mind. In fact, she preferred the anonymity. To have her name attached to a method for optimizing killing felt antithetical to the oath she had taken and the life she had tried to lead. She had never wanted to be a soldier. She had been a nurse who was forced by circumstance to become a warrior, and she viewed the technique not as an innovation to be celebrated, but as a grim necessity born of a desperate winter. She was content to let the army absorb the lesson without the teacher, happy to fade into the background where she felt she belonged. After her retirement, Ruth settled into a small, quiet cottage not far from the hospital where she had worked for 3 decades. She filled her days with the simple domestic rituals that had been denied her for so long, tending a garden, reading history books, and writing long letters to old friends who were slowly dying off one by one. She kept in touch with Private Martinez, the soldier who had dragged ammunition to her side during the battle. They wrote to each other twice a year for the rest of their lives. Christmas and Bastogne Day, 2 survivors bound by a shared memory of cold and gunfire that neither could ever fully explain to their families. They never met again after the war, but those letters were a lifeline, a silent acknowledgement that they were the only 2 people on Earth who truly understood what the other had survived. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, Ruth N., now 76 and frail with arthritis, but possessing eyes that were still sharp and clear, received an invitation to return to Bastogne for a commemoration ceremony. She hesitated for weeks. The thought of returning to the place where she had lost so much of herself was terrifying. But in the end, she felt she owed it to the men who hadn't made it, to Tommy and to Sergeant Doherty, and to the countless soldiers whose hands she had held as they died. She traveled to Belgium with a group of veterans, many of whom were younger than her, but who treated her with a reverence that made her uncomfortable. The Bastogne she returned to was not the frozen hellscape of her memory. It was a bustling town rebuilt and modern, the scars of war hidden beneath decades of peace. The ceremony was held at the Martyrs Memorial, a great star-shaped stone monument that overlooked the town. Speeches were made, flags were waved, and old men wept openly. Ruth stood apart from the main crowd, leaning on her cane, looking out over the rolling hills that were now covered in deep, peaceful drifts of snow, looking deceptively similar to that December in 1944. After the ceremony, she walked down to the town square, visiting the spot where the aid station had stood. The building was gone, replaced by a modern pharmacy, but the layout of the streets was the same. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the noise of the traffic faded, replaced by the scream of artillery and the rhythmic hammering of the Browning. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter, and felt a presence beside her. Ruth Kowalski died in her sleep in February 1999, at the age of 80. She was found in her favorite armchair, a book on her lap, and a picture of her brother Tommy on the side table. She had requested a simple military service, and that was what she got. Her coffin was draped with the American flag, and an honor guard fired a volley that echoed the gunnery she had once mastered. There were no generals at her funeral, no reporters, no headlines. Just a handful of veterans whose lives she had pieced back together during those 35 years at the VA, and a delegation from the 101st Airborne Association who had come to pay their respects to the nurse who had fought. In the end, Ruth Kowalski's legacy wasn't in the history books or in the training manuals that quietly carried her innovation. It was in the thousands of men who came home because she held the line when there was no line to hold, and in the thousands more who found peace in her later years because she understood the darkness they carried. She had crossed the ocean to save lives, and when she had to, she had taken lives to do it. It was a burden she had carried with grace and humility, a testament to the invisible, unyielding strength of those who serve, heal, and fight when the world demands they be both at once.